Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My guest today is children's author, Professor Dr. George Stanley. Hi George, thanks for coming.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's delightful to be here.
You didn't start out wanting to be a children's author, you wanted to be a spy.
That's right, and sometimes I think I still am. But
that's what I was going to ask you, are you naturally nosy?
I think I sort of am, and I hate to admit that, but I suppose I am a little nosy.
Well, aren't most writers, don't you think it is that curiosity about other people in their lives?
I believe that. In fact, I did an article a long time ago about how to get information for your stories, and one of the things I said was, it's perfectly all right to eavesdrop. And I was thinking particularly about one time at an airport in London, but I think writers have to be nosy. You know, you don't have to be bad about it, but I think you have to pay attention to what's going on around you.
So if you're standing in line in Walmart, you're listening to the conversations of the other people standing in line.
Oh, yes. I'm watching people, I'm listening to conversations, and I'm trying not to be too obvious about it, but I think that's the way you gain information that you can put in your stories.
Now you started writing in Chad, let's qualify that it's not Chad, Oklahoma, and you started writing for adults, is that correct?
That's right, right. I had always wanted to write, but at that time I was writing typical professorial types of things that nobody ever reads, really. But
other professors.
Maybe other professors. I'm not even quite sure about that. But I was in Chad. I had a Fulbright at the university there, and was living in the European section of the city, and the French section, I mean, there were no other Americans around, and the French were keeping a very low profile, and so I was sort of by myself. And the only thing that kept me from going insane, really, was listening to the BBC. Mm-hmm. And they had a program called World Service Short Story, where they took readers' stories and dramatized them. Mm-hmm. And so I sent in about 3 or 4 altogether. I just finished my doctorate in South Africa, and I had a lot of really interesting stories to write about mm-hmm. that part of the world. So that's how it all started, but they were for adults.
What made you turn to children's writing?
Well, I think deep down I'd always wanted to be a children's writer. I always liked Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys when I was growing up, but what actually happened was my wife and I married in 1974, and I gained 2 brothers-in-law who were Detroit mm-hmm. policemen. Mm-hmm. And the first time we were in Detroit, I went with them on their rounds. They were evidence technicians, and we pulled bodies out of the canal, and there were drug busts and bullets out of the wall and things like this. But I met a lady who was in charge of the serology laboratory that has to do with body mm-hmm. fluids, and she told me about a crime that had been solved by unsealing the flap of an envelope. And she had unsealed the flap scientifically and had found that there was more saliva on the right-hand side of the flap, and that it creased across the arc to the left-hand side. And usually people who are left-handed lick envelope flaps from right to left, and if they're right-handed, they go from left to right. So one of the suspects was left-handed, and so this envelope flap, plus some other things, helped convict him of a crime. And I came home to Lawton and tested some people and wrote it up and called it the saliva solution. And I sent it to Child Life, and they bought it and wanted me to do a series, and so that started my career.
Well, you know now all of us who are watching or here today are going to go and try this ourselves.
That's right. Well, most people, once I tested 25 people, 24 people did that. The 25th person licked the envelope flap from the middle to both sides, and most people who do that are ambidextrous, so, and this person was, so.
Is it important to be that accurate even when you're doing fiction?
I think it's very important. I don't like fiction set in fictional places, and you'd be surprised how often or how many readers really know the information you're talking about. I had a short story in Jack and Jill a number of years ago called Escape from East Berlin, mm-hmm. and there wasn't anything wrong with the story, but in the illustration, I had a student, of course I think this could only happen in a military community like Lawton, but one of my students said, wait a minute, this is not a West German machine gun, I mean an East German machine gun, this is a West German machine gun. And I didn't have any idea, but readers do zero in on things like that.
Does that bother you if there's a little mistake like that?
Yes, it does. In fact, a book called The Ukrainian Egg Mystery had 6 girls who were playing ice hockey. And this error got through me, it got through my editor, it got through the copy editor. It was already in galley form when I realized that hockey doesn't have 4 periods, it has 3 periods. And so with a prepositional phrase here and a clause there, I was able to make the change. But if things like that get through, then you'll hear from readers. You really will.
And I bet children are particularly discerning, aren't they?
Oh yes, very much so. They get very upset if you call things by the wrong name, and if you make those mistakes, then they don't really have a lot of faith in you from then on. So it's important not to do it.
I mentioned you were a children's author, and yet when we're talking about children's literature, we're talking about so many different categories.
Yes.
Could you tell us some of the different levels that are recognized now in publishing?
Well, I make 2 major distinctions because I'm a mass market writer, and I basically write original paperbacks. I write for entertainment, I write to make money, and I want, that's what I enjoy. I don't write books that necessarily will win awards or maybe be placed in libraries. So I make that major distinction. And a mass market writer is almost like someone who's working on a Hollywood production, because I may be the head writer, but there's also the director and the producer and all the other people that are necessary to put together a product. And so I work with my editors and copy editors, and if they want changes, we make the changes, and I don't complain and play the prima donna that my words will never be changed, those sorts of things. So that's a major distinction.
Are there levels, for example, like that you were going to write differently if you write for early grades and middle grades? And
you know, among those you can, and they pretty well cross the lines, but I am writing series now for beginning readers, and that's harder than the middle grade series I'm doing, because with the middle grade series I can work between 110 and 140 pages, and there's no problem there. But with the early grades, we started out this series, Scaredy Cats, with 50 manuscript pages, and soon discovered that's really too many. 45 is probably preferable, because you need a lot of white on the pages, you need 1-sentence paragraphs, you really need 1-line sentences. These are much better if they do have that, and so I've been able to bridge that gap between early chapter books and middle grade readers, and also up to young adult. The one area that I don't think I can write for, because I don't have the voice, is adult. I will write something and it will sound, the characters may be 40 or 50 years old, but they sound like they're 10. So,
are you a child at heart? Is this a child within you writing?
Well, I think that's true. You know, you've heard that before, and I think that if you're a children's book writer, you write for the child within you. And my wife and I talk about this a lot. It's just, I'll be 55 my next birthday, and it just amazes me, because we know people who are 20 and 30, and they seem so mature, and we seem so childish, really. So, but I think that's part of what helps me write for young people.
When you first started writing for young people, you focused on children's stories,
yes,
short
that's right,
stories.
yeah.
What about the short story format particularly appealed to you in the early parts of your career, early stages of your career?
I'm not quite sure if this is what actually appealed to me, but I do know if you're beginning writing, it's probably a good idea to work with shorter fiction, because magazine editors are much more likely to take a chance on you. And I think it's easier to get published in the short story format. I also like to be able to tell a story in just 4 or 5 pages, because I know, especially reluctant readers, will enjoy short stories. In fact, I've done some scary stories for teenagers that are like 3, 4, 5 pages long, and they tell a complete story in that number of pages, and that's very appealing to reluctant teenage readers. And I think it's fun to be able to tell a complete story in just 2 or 3 pages, or for younger readers in something like 500 words. It's hard, but it's also very satisfying to be able to do that.
You've also written a lot about the craft of writing short
Yes,
stories and writing for children. Is that hard when you switch from being the child? Because obviously you can't write those from a child's perspective.
That's right. Well, I don't think it's hard, and I think it's helpful because I tend not to be too verbose. I want it to be as clear as possible, and so it's. I think it helps really because you can do, in fact, a couple of recent articles are things like 3 steps to this and 5 steps to this. So rather than hinder, I think it might help just a little bit because you want to. Maybe, I know a lot of elementary school teachers who are friends of mine, they will talk often to adults that way. It's like, now then we're going to do this. I think I sort of do the same thing really, so, but I think it helps.
Well, you think in writing a how-to book for other writers, that helped you as a writer as well, and when you articulate that process, that you understand what you're doing a little bit better?
I think so, because you're really analyzing it to show the prospective writer, and I think you then are in turn showing yourself, and so I think it does help.
You mentioned the 3 steps, and you've written an article called The 3 Steps to Writing a Successful Children's Story, or
Yes.
3 Simple Steps.
3 simple steps, right.
3 simple steps. Well, could you summarize those 3 steps for us?
Well, this was a really interesting situation, one of those things you sort of fall into. But several years ago, the principal of our children's elementary school asked me to teach 3rd and 4th graders how to write a short story. So I wrote what I called a bare bones short story that had nothing more, nothing less than what you actually have to have a short story, a beginning, middle, and end, and maybe 3 attempts to solve the problem and a climax and resolution. And then later he asked me to do the same thing for 5th and 6th graders as our boys grew. And so I added some things to the story, really just an expanded bare bones, and I thought this is a really amazing procedure here. And I liked the story I had written so much that I took the bare bones and sort of molded it and added my style, and or whatever you want to call it, and turned it into a story for highlights for children. And the process was just an almost perfect process to show how to put stories together. And so it started with the bare bones and then expanded bare bones and what I call the story with style, where you take a story that you know is actually a short story, not just a collection of sentences, and then mold it and then send it off. And so it's been very, very useful. A lot of teachers use it in the classroom, and so I think it's helped a lot of beginning writers get stories written and published.
I love that 3rd one, having your own style, and that's hard, isn't it? Because sometimes I think we lose confidence.
Well, that's true.
And being different.
That's true, and I think also it helps beginning writers see that the first story you write is, or shouldn't be your style. I think that's a problem I've had with students. They'll say, if I show them things that are wrong in stories, they'll say things like, well, that's my style. And when it's not really, it's just the way you've written the story. And so if you start out and not worry about that, then you know that you will have a short story structurally. And then you can put your style in it, change the names and add some dialogue and just things that really put your stamp on it.
Has your style changed over the years?
I think so. I think I've gotten better at what I do, which I think is good to know. I'll look at some of the things I wrote early on, and will often think, how in the world did this get published? I think I've been able to. I'm not quite sure it's the style. I've been able to edit a little better. I really feel with the series that I'm doing now that I don't make as many mistakes as I used to make.
Well, I like that. George, we want to talk some more about your writing and some of your series, so stay with us, and we'll be back after a brief message with more from Dr. George Stanley.
This is an RSU-TV Encore presentation of Writing Out Loud.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome back to Writing Out Loud. I'm talking to Dr. George Stanley, the author of over 40 books, including Bugs for Breakfast. George, when we closed out the first segment, we were talking about how you've changed as a writer. How has the children's literature business changed, children's publishing? Because books aren't the same as they were several years ago.
No, that's true. There are more paperbacks now, well, libraries have less money to buy books, and kids seem to have more money to buy paperback books. So I think the mass market, the paperback part of children's publishing has changed a great deal, has just exploded. But it's also changed in content. Like right now, for instance, most of what kids are reading are scary stories. And this has just really proliferated, and so I think that's been one of the major changes, the content area.
Do we also find children's books dealing with more serious issues now than they used to? I mean, when I was reading children's books, Dick and Jane would be out jumping rope, and that was pretty much it.
Well, yes. In fact, I just got back from a trip to see my editor and agent, and I just asked one of the editors, what are you looking for? Because I'll sit around and I'll think about things, but I thought, well, I'm just going to ask her what she's looking for. And one of the things she told me was that she's looking for a good book on AIDS. And so I think books are, well, I think you have both spectrums, really. They're very serious books, but they're also books that are just pure entertainment.
Have gender roles changed in books? Because I know when I was reading books back in the first and second grade, most of the women were stay-at-home mothers or nurses or secretaries, and most of the fathers had traditional male-type jobs. Is that changing?
Oh, very much so, really. In fact, I see it. Now, I'll have my characters. If I have a main character who's a boy in one, or a main character who's a girl in the other, they're a lot of times doing the same things, but I'll find it in terminology, for instance. And I have to watch this because, you grow up, you learn certain words, and you use them, but I remember one, I used the term firefighter. I made sure that I used the term firefighter instead of fireman. And so, it just shows up in a number of different ways.
George, we know that you wanted to be a spy, and I wonder if that's the reason that you've written under a number of different names. We're not going to call them pseudonyms. In your case, let's call them aliases.
Aliases, all right, that's true. A lot of it, now, I much prefer to write under my own name. I don't think there is a greater thrill than seeing your own name in print. And I'm always amazed at my students who just start out and they have these really unique pseudonyms. And I think I don't know why, and I always tell them that they need to wait about that until the story or the book is going to be published. But most of it has had to do with marketing. I was doing a series, or several series, for the youth publications of the Saturday Evening Post Company. They're now called the Children's Better Health Institute. And I had several series running in same magazines, and they didn't want 4 or 5 stories by George Stanley. They wanted them by, even though I was writing them all. So I had Stan Edwards and things like this. A lot of it, sometimes it's because the company owns the name. And I did a series under the name Adam Mills, and I'm not Adam Mills. I did a couple of Bobbsey twins, and I was known as Laura Lee Hope, as everyone else was. But I'm writing a book, a series now called Spine Tinglers under the name M.T. Coffin. And see, we wanted a pseudonym, sort of like R.L. Stein, and with initials, but we wanted something, Avon told me they wanted A, B, or C, because that would be eye level. And so I worked and came up with M.T. as an empty coffin. And I wanted to spell it C-O-F-F-E-N, so it wouldn't be too obvious, but the marketing people said, no, if we're going to do this, we're going to spell it right. And I'm not writing all of these. You can find out who's actually writing them if you look in the copyright page. But Avon has now written a biography of M.T. Coffin, and I have a wife whose name is Carrie A. Coffin, and a daughter whose name is Barry A. Coffin, and a son whose name is Philip A. Coffin. And so it's sort of a play on, that was just a play on words.
When you write in an established series, say like the Bobbsey twins, those characters are created.
Right.
And you're a very creative person. Is that frustrating for you to work with someone else's characters?
Well, that was a very frustrating period. I enjoyed doing that. I was working with a packager, Mega Books, and they were wonderful to work with. And the reason I did it was not because I particularly cared about the Bobbsey twins, but they were also doing a series called the Nancy Drew Case Files and the Hardy Boy Case Files. And I grew up reading those and thought it would be wonderful to do a Nancy Drew or Hardy Boys. But what happens is they give you what's called a Bible, and it tells you what the characters can and cannot do. And it was funny from time to time because I would write the story and send it to New York, and the editor would say, well, we like this, but you know, the Bobbsey twins would never do anything like that. And so you had to get used to it. It's very hard, it really is, writing characters that are so well known.
So you just sort of pushed the envelope with the Bobbsey twins. So
Well, I just decided I just could not. Well, the editors kept saying, the book is good, but the tone is wrong. And I guess I should have just said, what do you mean? But I kept looking up tone in the dictionary and whatever, just to try to find out. And basically, what they meant was, my books were not reading like the other books in the series. And I told my editor at Avon that, and she said, well, I should do this. I'm very good at copying other people's style. And editors have to be very good at copying other people's style. I'm not, I don't think, and so I've not done a series like that since, where the book has to read as though, they all have to read as though they've been written by one person.
And you mentioned earlier the Scaredy Cat series. Now,
Yes,
is that all? That's your signature?
That's all mine, right.
Under the name G.E.
G.E. Stanley.
G.E. Stanley, okay. And these are chapter books, right?
These
And
are
for what age group?
6 through 9. That'd be like first, second, third grade. These are first chapter books because young people of that age want to be reading chapter books like their older brothers and sisters, and so it's a really big thing for them. I've seen kids come into signings, they'll say things like, oh, it's a chapter book, it's a chapter book. And so that's what these are. They're for that particular, the first readers they'll have.
One of the titles in the series is Bugs for Breakfast. I love that. How did you come up with that title?
Well, I had 2 titles to begin with. One was called Real Cave Girls Don't Eat Bugs. And then we thought that was a little bit too sophisticated. When I'm writing my books, I start with titles. I usually do not have the story at all. I'm at a fortunate position, period in my career, where I can sell a book on a title. And I'm not quite sure where I got Bugs for Breakfast. There's no telling. I sit around thinking about titles all the time. In fact, I've probably irritated people before when I tell them, oh yeah, well, I'm always thinking about this. It doesn't make any difference where I am. I'm always thinking about a book. But I came up with a title for a book that will be out Christmas called We Wish You a Scary Christmas. And that was it. And we sold it on the title. In fact, it took me 3 tries to get the storyline right, because I sent the storyline to Avon. They said, no, we just don't like this, and you know, work on another one. So I worked on another one. Well, no, we just don't like this. And so the 3rd time, I got it. But titles come, I don't have any problem thinking up titles, and I very seldom had any titles change. I did have one in the Spine Tingler series called Read a Book and Die. And I loved that, and marketing loved it, and the editors loved it. But the marketing people said, we love this title, but we don't think it's a good idea to associate reading and dying. And so we decided to change it to Check It Out and Die. So.
Now, the Spine Tingler series is for a little older reading
It's
group.
for older, yeah. This is for 8 to 12, right?
Okay. And what are some of the titles in that series?
Well, the first one I did was called Billy Baker's Dog Won't Stay Buried. And that's done very well, and the editors think a lot of it has to do with the title. And then another one that's just out is called The Dead Kid Did It. and which I think is a wonderful excuse, you know. And then don't go to the principal's office.
That's the one I relate to.
Oh, that's true. And the Curse of the Cheerleaders I'm working on, and we try to make them sound scary because kids today like to read scary books, but we want them to enjoy being scared, but not. We don't have any of the slasher type elements in them because I don't think of that as real horror.
Why do we like to be scared even as adults?
Well, I think we like to be scared like on television, watching television movies or the film and art books because it's a safe way to be scared. We can be scared and experience that. I think there's a thrill to being scared. I think that's what people like when they're riding roller coasters. But there's a human need, I guess, to experience this, but to do it in sort of a safe confine. And so I think that's why horror appeals a lot to young people. They can experience this and maybe think about things that we normally don't think about, such as death, and yet do it in a safe way. And in
a fun way, because obviously you're having fun in these books.
That's right, yeah. And I think there's nothing wrong with doing it in a fun way because it helps us understand or live with this. I think if we just dwelt on the horrors of death and dying, it would be very difficult on us psychologically. And I think this is sort of like a release valve to deal with things that are difficult to deal with.
And in that respect, are you writing as much for yourself as you are the kids?
Well, I don't believe in writing for therapy, but I think writing for me is very therapeutic. So yes, it is very much an escape.
Well, George, congratulations on your 40-plus novels, on all these wonderful titles, and on your grand sense of humor. Look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.